Robb Wolf, welcome to the Biohacking Secrets Show.
I'm honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
Honored to have you. I have a delicious orange flavored element drink here that is one of the products that you've created. And maybe you can tell our listeners a little bit about it, because I've been addicted to these things. I mentioned before we started recording, I'm good for 3 to 5 a day. And,
yeah, the cocaine really facilitates that. So, I mean, it's kind of a longish story now. I'll try to be brief, but I've eaten pretty low carb for 23, 24 years now, and that works great for me for most things other than like jiu-jitsu and some kind of higher intensity exercise type stuff. But I just kind of thought that was my lot in life. Like this was, the trade-off that I had to have, for like good digestive health. Because I had ulcerative colitis so bad that I was facing a surgery and immunosuppressant drugs like 24 years ago. And this shift to kind of lower carb ancestral type diet basically healed that process. But I've just continued to tinker and fiddle and look for options. And I found a couple of guys, Tyler Cartwright and Luis Villasenor, who are the founders of a movement called Keto Gains, which is it's kind of a boot camp intervention where they teach people appropriate protein, ketogenic diets. They have smart strength and conditioning, and like the results that people get from a body composition perspective are just stunning. Like they're really, really impressive, really know what they're doing. And I noticed that they had some people that were doing jiu-jitsu and doing some CrossFit at a pretty high level and following what they were recommending. And I was kind of like, there's something interesting here. Like they're doing something interesting. So I chatted with these guys and kind of showed them what I was up to. And they were like, yeah, your diet looks pretty good, as far as protein, carbs, fat, but you probably need more electrolytes, specifically sodium. And because these guys are smarter than I am, it took me a good year to listen to them. Because whenever you have a coach and your coach tells you to do something, of course, you never do it the first time they tell you to do it. You got to wait and suffer and flail and struggle and everything. But I finally followed the basic recommendations that they had, which was try to get at least 5 grams of sodium per day from like all sources, dietary sources, supplemental, the whole 9 yards. And when I did that, it was just magic. Like I had this low gear at jiu-jitsu, and my sleep was better, and like all this other stuff was just dramatically improved. And the crowd that I serve tends to be kind of geeked out on lower carb diets. And when I was looking at the areas that they struggled, I'm like, oh my God, all of these people that I'm trying to serve probably need more electrolytes and more sodium and all this stuff. So we started this as a freemium option. It was basically make your own keto aid, drink. And it was a recipe for take this much sodium and this much potassium and this much magnesium and mix it all together and do some lemon juice and stevia and shake it up. And, there you go. And when we released that thing, about 6 months later, we had like 500,000 downloads of it. Like it just went like wildfire. And the feedback we had was amazing. People were reporting that they just felt great and like sleep stuff was improved and all these, good things were happening. And then the folks that had done this freemium thing, they said, hey, why don't you guys do a convenience play? Like, this is all well and good, but like traveling with 3 bags of white powder and having TSA want to do a body cavity check on people wasn't cool. And so it was literally the people following us who had done this make it yourself thing that they convinced us to try doing a stick pack deal. And that's, we launched 3 years ago. And I think Element is one of the fastest growing health and wellness companies in the world right now. Like it's just going like crazy. And I think that we really identified like a legit need for people, and the stuff tastes pretty good and it's convenient. And, that's the kind of 30,000 foot view story on the whole thing.
Yeah, you guys did a great job. I mean, the raspberry flavor, the watermelon flavor, the orange flavor, I love all of them. And it's, as someone that is conscious to stay hydrated without diluting my own electrolytes, yep. I think there's a lot of people that are overhydrating based on perhaps poor advice. But it makes it enjoyable to drink water too. where, having a little bit of flavor in there, that's one of the things that many people miss when, shifting away from juices and sodas and less healthy options, is they're like, okay, it's not hyper palatable or exciting to my brain. I don't enjoy this as much as I did before. Let's kind of talk a bit about the demonization of sodium, because that's something that all of us grew up on. And there's still probably not too many of our listeners, but perhaps some people that still subscribe to that. And then how our need for sodium and electrolytes shifts on these paleo and ketogenic nutritional templates.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because on the one hand, the demonization of sodium is both completely accurate and completely inaccurate. It's accurate in that sodium is a player in hypertension, elevated blood pressure, and hypertension is a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease. The problem that arises, though, is that it doesn't really matter how much sodium you consume if you end up with hypertension. Because it's mainly driven by hyperinsulinism, by chronically elevated insulin levels, which is more driven by over-consuming calories and in particular, over-consuming refined carbohydrates. So when insulin levels go up, then we tend to retain sodium because we also release a hormone called aldosterone, which causes us to hold on to sodium. And what's kind of crazy in this is that there have been really well done randomized controlled trials, like gold standard science, looking at low sodium intake for people with hypertension, and it just doesn't bring down their blood pressure that much. It'll bring it down a little bit. And then the flip side is like these folks, sodium sensitive hyper responders, if they eat a really salty meal, their blood pressure will definitely go up, and then it will tend to go back down to a chronically elevated baseline. But if sodium was the driver, then simply removing sodium would be the solution, but it's not. It's kind of a bystander. So, this is where we've been in this weird spot where we know that sodium's important in this story. It definitely is a factor in hypertension, but it's not the driving factor. And ironically, this is where like low carb diets oftentimes get almost made fun of. It's like, oh, well, you're going to pee like crazy the first, 5 days you're on that. And it's like, yeah, because your chronically elevated insulin levels and all the inflammation that you have that causes you to retain sodium and water is being released. And so you're kind of peeing your way out of cardiovascular disease in that circumstance. And this tends to be what happens when two things happen when people improve their diet. And this doesn't have to be low carb. It doesn't have to be paleo, but people generally get the largest amount of sodium dietarily from processed foods. And when people are eating a highly processed food diet, it just comes hand in glove, that processed foods have typically a lot of sodium. So if you shift towards paleo or vegan or Mediterranean or anything that is minimally processed foods, you are going to dramatically reduce the intake of your sodium. Now, this might be kind of good in some ways because with shifting towards minimally processed foods, we also tend to reduce our glycemic load and also our calorie load. And so these problems of, chronically overeating and being insulin resistant, we can start reversing those things. So for some people, that's going to be really good. But at some point, the folks that were hypertensive are going to be normotensive. They're going to have normal blood pressure, and then they may start having problems with eating low carb or eating a minimally processed diet, and that they'll go from like seated to standing and they'll get the room spins, or they try to exercise and it feels like their heart is beating like 3 times faster than it should at any given work output. And these are all signs and symptoms of inadequate sodium levels, of hyponatremia. So then at some point, folks need to start reintroducing more sodium, particularly in the lower the carbohydrate intake, typically the more they need to do that. There's this process called the natriuresis of fasting. Basically, we lose sodium when we begin to fast or we're in a low carbohydrate state. And again, this can be true if somebody's eating a vegan diet. They go from overeating standard American diet, they go to a vegan diet. The vegan diet is very low in sodium. They tend to decrease their total insulin load because they're not overeating. And then at some point, these folks will probably benefit from increasing the amount of sodium that they consume. Usually, a safe spot for most people to be as a starting point is about 5 grams of sodium per day. Some people may need double that and even a little bit more, but that's a pretty good spot for most people to be.
Excellent. I'm curious because there's a lot of talk in the health and natural wellness community about adrenal fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the symptoms that sort of mirror low sodium are also attributed to adrenal fatigue.
Yeah.
I'm curious kind of your thoughts on that relationship and how many people that think their adrenals are jacked just need more sodium.
A ton of them. And I think that like the thyroid issues, like some people will change dietary practices. Now you can tank thyroid from going too low calorie for too long and whatnot. But, like low carb diets have oftentimes been associated with these kind of thyroid dysregulatory issues and low thyroid. But when you look into the physiology, inadequate sodium tends to cause a stress response in the body. We will release cortisol, we'll release epinephrine. And part of what those hormones do is it's another mechanism for us to retain sodium. So then it's these alternate methods to retain sodium because aldosterone is low in a low carb environment and whatnot. So it's finding these alternate directions. But I think so much of that, like HPTA axis dysregulation, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal issues, I don't know if it's 90% or 95%, but I think a massive chunk of it is overly aggressive calorie curtailment, inadequate protein, and then really underconsumption of sodium is just this huge thing. And I know that that's self-serving for the guy that's like a co-founder of a company that's selling people salt, but it's just an interesting piece to this is if somebody is put on a medically supervised ketogenic diet, for like epilepsy, for example, that dietitian will by hook or by crook make sure that the person gets at least 5 grams of sodium per day. And what's interesting is when you look at the medically supervised folks that are managed specifically for a ketogenic diet, it's well understood the whole naturesis of fasting. And you don't see in the medical literature like this huge incidence of what we, this HPTA axis dysregulation, like adrenal fatigue. Like it's just not a thing. It's a thing when you look at pop culture recommendations around low carb diets. And I was guilty of this. Like I was never afraid of sodium, but I didn't fully appreciate the way that my friends Tyler and Luis did, how critical and non-negotiable sodium is in particular in a low carb environment. Yeah. And there's all these other things that kind of bring you to the same spot. Like so much of what we see as like overreaching, overtraining, God, if it doesn't look a whole lot like inadequate sodium intake. And then when people start addressing sodium intake properly, you can still certainly overtrain, but if people find that their work capacity is increased and their recovery is improved and their sleep is better, like their heart rate variability scores improve when their sodium levels are on point. So I think there's a lot of different things that get attributed to too low of carb, too much exercise, and it may actually be inadequate sodium as kind of the inadequate sodium is introducing a degree of stress that then makes you more prone to having problems with the low carb diet or the exercise, or the flip side is if you have adequate sodium, then you have more capacity to exercise more or handle the low carb diet.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see it a lot when people introduce time restricted eating or they get on a paleo or a vegan or a ketogenic nutritional template, they start working out. They're adding all of these acute stressors, but at a certain point, it's like, depending on their recoverability and their capacity to handle stress, they can hit this tipping point where these acute stressors become chronic stressors, especially if multiple of these interventions also deplete sodium and electrolytes. And there's even a good amount of evidence to suggest that the wireless electricity in our world increases our demand of electrolytes and sodium in order to buffer some of the cellular stress that can cause. So it is important to be conscientious of that more is not necessarily better, and stacking too many of these interventions too fast without being conscientious of your electrolyte and sodium balance and some of these things, or not paying attention to the signs and symptoms, which I'm going to ask you about in a second, can lead to chronic problems. So, which kind of begs my next question, like how, frequent urination. Of course, that's one of them, and something that a lot of people, when they start cleaning up their diet, they're all of a sudden they're like, I don't know if I need to get my prostate checked, but I'm going to the bathroom like 5 times a night.
Right.
What are some of the signs and symptoms to look out for that could indicate that someone is low sodium, needs more?
Lethargy, fatigue, brain fog are some pretty clear problems. Elevated heart rate, at kind of a modest work output, or like if you're used to training and say like you wear a heart rate band, or if you just kind of pay attention to how you're feeling and you're like, oh my God, this hill feels particularly hard today, So it will take your exercise tolerance and decrease it if we have inadequate sodium. And then the really late stage on this stuff is cramping. People start getting, I do jiu-jitsu, and like the toe cramp deal is this thing that is just endemic in jiu-jitsu. But one is so far gone by the time you start cramping, because you've gone through a period of time where you've been electrolyte deficient, such that you clearly have decreased cognitive performance, fine motor skills. You usually have some brain fog, lethargy, fatigue, and all those things happen earlier. So those more subtle and somewhat subjective, things are really the canary in the coal mine and the beginning of this stuff. And it's challenging at first to get people in their bodies enough to just pay attention to like, how do you feel? But where I used to attribute like the mid-afternoon kind of energy slump, even while eating low carb, I was like, oh, it's like low blood sugar, or it's this, or it's that. I started wearing a continuous glucose monitor, and my blood sugar was just, it was rock solid. It didn't change. And I'm like, well, what the hell is going on? And then I tried doing some electrolytes, and I felt immediately better. And it was literally like a light switch was flipped. I'm like, oh, okay. I'm inadequate sodium, and I'm starting down this path of just feeling bad, because every process in our body is driven by sodium potassium pumps. Like that is the basic currency of energy production via, ATP manufacturing. So it's not surprising that if our sodium potassium pumps get off by a little bit, that we're going to feel off. And electrolytes and pH are probably the most tightly regulated physiological processes in the body. And they're tightly regulated because if either of them go a little high or a little low for too long or too great a magnitude, we can get very sick or we can die from it. So it's we notice this dysregulation, we feel it, but it's funny. I've been aware of this stuff now for about 5 years, like really acutely aware of this need and this problem. But I cannot tell you how many times I've come home from training or doing work or whatever, and my wife looks at me and she's like, have you had enough electrolytes today? And I'm like, damn you, it's like I'm a co-owner of the company, and I'm still like shitting the bed on just putting this stuff in a jug and drinking it. I'm too busy, or I can't be that thing. And then I'll go over and mix them up, or I'll do like some salami and cheese or something, a really salty meal. I'm like, oh, I feel fine now, So yeah. It's
a big problem. That's funny. That's like a mom/wife 2.0 question.
Oh, totally, man. It's she's deadly with that. Yeah.
the other thing that I wanted to kind of talk about before we kind of close out on elements, and for guys that are listening, drinklmnt.com is the website where you can pick this up. As I mentioned, I'm a huge fan of the watermelon, the strawberry, the orange. I love those flavor profiles. And I'm someone I've been filtering my water and, everything from reverse osmosis to using the Berkey filters and remineralizing it for years. But what I've found is that a lot of those electrolyte and mineral solutions, they taste awful. There's some really good ones that on paper are fantastic by like Trace Minerals Research and stuff like that, but you put it in your water and you're like, right. or you have to throw back a whole bunch of these like Schussler's cell salts every day, and none of it's particularly enjoyable, which over time just decreases compliance. And the element stuff tastes amazing and it makes it enjoyable. And for me, at least, that's the key where I'm going to continue drinking this stuff because I enjoy it. I like it, and it makes that habit and proper hydration and mineral balance just, more doable for me.
Yeah. We have a big 64 ounce shaker jug with a, plastic cap on it and everything. And I just mix 2 of the elements in that and shake it up and put it in the fridge. And my 7 and 9-year-old daughters, they just fill up cups throughout the day. And prior to doing that, both of them would run around with these like just chronically like chapped lips. My wife would lather them up with chapstick and everything. I'm like, that helps. But the thing is they're just like, they're running like wild banshees all day, consuming no fluids. And the fluids that they do consume really don't have enough electrolytes. And she was like, well, why don't you mix up some element for them? So I ordered this giant jug and put it in the refrigerator, and like the kids crush that. And I just kind of rotate the flavors. But it to that point, like it tastes good enough that the kids look forward to doing it. And they're like, oh, I'm a little thirsty. I'm going to go grab a cup of element, and it's on their mind because it tastes good enough that they actually want to do it. But it's not so hyper palatable that they're over there like mainlining it and selling their bodies on the street to pay for it and stuff like that. So it's a nice middle ground on that regard.
Totally. Yeah. And then it also seems that people who have a ton of juice boxes and things like that in the home for their kids, they end up drinking them too. I've had clients over the years who are like, yeah, I don't know if I was low carb or low sugar or what, but I just crushed like 9 of my kids' juice boxes and, threw off my macros for the day.
Right.
Which tends to happen. You've also done some fun things with your element products and like margaritas. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that for the people that like their tequila. So
when we first started this whole process, I really wasn't sure if like the world needed another electrolyte product. I was kind of like, really, there's Gatorade and there's this and that and Noon and all these things. So as a backup, we thought about some flavors that would go well with mixed drinks, like a margarita base. And so our first flavor was a citrus salt, which goes amazing as a margarita base. And then we did a lemon habanero and a mango chili, which also like
those are good as well.
Tequila, vodka, like there's some interesting options on that. We have a seasonal flavor that's grapefruit, and we do like a salty dog, like a Greyhound. So it's the grapefruit plus tequila, and it's got the salt in it and everything, and they taste amazing. And it really is starting. It's almost like I'm selling CrossFit now. It's like, oh, it cures cancer, and it'll make you 6'2" and lean, but it's so much of what is negative about the after effects of alcohol is the dehydration and the electrolyte depletion. And if you consume some electrolytes with your stuff, you tend to just feel less horrible. Now, I'm not saying you can do like 15 shots of tequila and walk away unscathed, but if you drink a fair amount and you have no adequate electrolytes versus drink a fair amount and have adequate electrolytes, it's a very, very noticeable, days. But gosh, those are the biggies, like the kind of margarita based things, the salty dog, the chocolate one. People have done like a Black Russian. So they'll do, so it's kind of a chocolate base, and they'll do a little bit of whole cream and and then the vodka with that and mix all that up. I'm trying to think what else. Like there's a couple of gin drinks also that people have spun up.
Are those all on the website? The drink?
They're all on the website. And if you go drinkelement.com/homebrew, then it's a bunch of the booze recipes, and it's also how to mix your own. Like if you don't want to buy Element, but you take some table salt, some no salt, which is potassium chloride, and then get a little bit of magnesium citrate, lemon juice, stevia, mix all that up, and then you can do your own shaker bottle of like your home brew of Element.
Yeah, I love it. I'm a big fan and have found over the years that the difference between having a couple cocktails and staying hydrated, throwing in some water in between, throwing in some Element in between, and then at the end of the night, hitting some N-acetylcysteine, some vitamin C, maybe some milk thistle. It's like the effects the next day are either completely mitigated or at least 30 to 50% less than they would be if none of those things were a part of it. And you just kind of threw caution to the wind and painted the town red.
Yeah.
Before we kind of move on and talk a bit about Sacred Cow and some of your books, your journey with ulcerative colitis, I think that's something that a lot of people are dealing with. And I've talked to folks over these past few years that are experiencing blood in their stools and anything they eat seems like it causes gas and bloating and or constipation or diarrhea. Were there any other tips that you found helpful or things that you've recommended and found that had a positive effect on other people in your community that may be dealing with some of these digestive disorders?
Man, yeah,
inflammatory conditions. Like, were you juicing? I know, like that's one that some people find helpful is getting rid of the fiber.
So interestingly, but the problem there is that I don't do great with a ton of carbs either. So juicing kind of gets it. So I think it's better. And this is where, interestingly, where like carnivore or getting close to carnivore may be helpful for some people, because I've found that like huge amounts of fiber, like a giant green salad, is not my friend. I can do a salad if it's almost kind of cooked a little bit. Like my wife will do, it's apple cider vinegar with some different spices in it and everything. But she'll put that on like some romaine lettuce and then let it marinate overnight, basically. But it's basically cooking that stuff, like it's kind of wilted, but not in a unappealing way. Like it's still a little al dente.
Right.
And I can eat a little bit of that and I'm okay. But, we're used to, I would do like these giant bowls of salad and then I would have these giant blowouts. And I'm like, well, I guess that's just the way it is. And it wasn't until the crazy carnivore people started talking about gut issues and autoimmunity, and like they had done everything. They did paleo, they did keto, they went autoimmune paleo, and usually they saw some degree of improvement, but it wasn't until they just fully cut out all plant material that they're like, that was like the shift in their healing. And to that end, I could potentially see some people benefiting maybe from a juice oriented process. I think that like the total vegan centric model of that is just very low protein. And I think it's going to be tough sledding. If your gut's already damaged, it's hard as hell to absorb your nutrients. And then if you eat a nutrient depleted diet, which I think veganism typically is, it's going to be really tough, but I think that folks frequently, maybe they end up on something like this juice deal or like a carnivore approach, and they figure out over time, okay, I can handle tomatoes and plantains and bananas and this and that, and I can't do this, and this, and so just over time, they usually get a little bit more latitude with things. I've seen really mixed response with regards to like probiotics. I'd say it's about a 50-50 coin toss. Some people it seems to help, and some people it seems to make them worse, and or they just get absolutely no benefit from it. So I see that as a real coin toss. And I see a lot of, I don't want to call it snake oil, but a lot of hopes and dreams sold around the idea of probiotics. And I see it at best as a coin toss. Like I think for some people, it's really great. And other people, it's pretty problematic. There was a product called Restore that was this kind of interesting.
Is that Zach Bush?
I think so. Yeah. And I've heard people just rave about Restore. They're like, I was crippled and then I did it. I personally felt like it started feeling really good the first couple of weeks, and then it kind of petered out and didn't really go anywhere for me. But I'm kind of like, I'm the worst. Nothing works for me. Everything sucks. It's like the fact that I had 2 weeks of improvement, I'm like, oh, there was really something to this, and I've talked to people that were really, really sick, and they're pretty emphatic that was like a major piece of figuring out their healing and recovery. And they end up needing to discover which foods are really serious trigger foods and stuff like that.
Absolutely. I've also seen a big connection with chronic sympathetic dominance. So people that are just kind of stuck in this fight or flight. And from an ancestral perspective, you think about like if your body thinks that you're being chased by a lion, they're not going to be partitioning a lot of biological resources to digestion.
And
it's going to affect your stomach acid production and your enzyme production and gastric juice flow and stuff, where I've been shocked in the past when people started really honing in and being consistent with meditation and some of these mindfulness practices to kind of come back to and redevelop their parasympathetic tone. They start finding their digestion improves, and some of the foods that they couldn't handle, or like, if they would eat a huge salad and it would turn their butt into a salad shooter, all of a sudden they're having normal stools from that. And you reminded me with the cooked salad overnight. That's huge. I've never done that or had it or recommended it, but it does make sense that you'd allow the apple cider vinegar and some of the other spices and possibly even citrus to start breaking it down. Other people have done massaged salads where they'll take like the kale or the lettuce and actually like with their hands
break it up
to start the digestive process, almost like not like a blended smoothie, but things that lower the digestive burden can also be helpful. So I think, thank you for those recommendations. Let's talk a little bit about, beef is framed as one of the most environmentally destructive foods and least healthy meats. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and some of the misconceptions around beef.
Yeah. And it would be easy to, I don't want to say this. It would be easy to do this really trite, like elevator pitch thing where it's like, well, this is preposterous and, just rattle it through. And I will say, I want to kind of frame this up a little bit. Within this kind of vegan-centric world, if you go vegan, you will live forever. You'll be skinny. You're going to save the planet. You're going to be morally superior. Like all this great stuff happens. And meat causes cancer. Meat causes type 2 diabetes. Meat's going to destroy the planet. This stuff is all like elevator pitch. It's all super elegant and slick and just rolls off the tongue. It seems very compelling. And the main thing that I would throw out there is I would encourage people, if you really do care about climate change, just file away maybe 1% of credulity around all of those claims and do some diligence on vetting them out. Because if climate change really is an important thing, then it's really important that we get it right. And if meat is the primary driver of climate change, as many people assert it is, then okay, we need to address that. If it is not the primary driver of climate change, but millions and tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people are being told that, and so we're looking in a direction that is not where the problem actually lies, then we're going to fuck a lot of things up. Yeah. And so it's so I'm not saying I'm right about this, but what I kind of want to couch it in is it's important enough that folks should enter into this with a pretty clean slate and then start assessing things at face value. And so, we did, my co-author and I, Diana Rogers, we did the book Sacred Cow, and we have a film by the same title. because we recognize that some people are not going to be willing to read a book on sustainable agriculture and, dig into all this stuff. So the film covers a lot of the same material, just in a different way, and it's quite good.
I didn't know you guys had a film. Is that out?
Yeah, it's out. Yeah, it's on all distribution channels. It's funny, as an aside, we were in the last stage, literally the last 11th hour stage of Sacred Cow becoming a Netflix original. And like, somebody at the top level said, no, we can't do this. And they like ceased all communications. They didn't even carry it generally. So the lower downs were very into it. And then it finally hit some level of vetting that somebody was like, no, we cannot carry this thing. But
I'm not the least bit surprised, but perhaps
the past 2 years is kind of like, oh yeah, color me shocked. Yeah,
it's the same people pushing the propaganda as opposed to science that, they're the COVID narrative aligns pretty well with the climate change narrative. And I'm not saying that there is not environmental problems, and that I do agree that we need to care about this planet, because as far as we know, it's all we've got. But there's so much nonsense around climate change.
There's a stunning amount. And, what we did is we got in and we looked at the ethical, environmental, and health considerations of a meat-inclusive food system. And we started looking at sacred cows around this topic. Here are these assumptions that, cows use up way too much land. Is one of these things that's thrown out there. Okay, well, let's dig into that. And what we find is that the land that cattle do well on is grasslands. And these grasslands are good at producing grass, and they're good at doing nothing else. They're not good for farming. You really shouldn't pave them over and turn them into strip malls or anything else, because they're involved with replenishing aquifers, and they're their own, climate change mitigating element, because they retain water and decrease the albedo of sunlight interfacing with the surface of the earth and everything. So, and 2/3 of the Earth's landmass are grasslands. They are literally amenable for nothing other than growing grass and supporting the animals that herbivores that graze on grasslands. And so, this notion that there's all this land that's misused. So it literally, it just couldn't be more false. If we back up 300, 400 years and we come back to the Americas, our grasslands are teeming with bison and elk and deer and moose. And, there were more grazing animals then than there are now. And we were not destroying the planet, and it was not causing climate catastrophe. And part of that is that we get into, cattle release all these greenhouse gases, in particular methane. This is true, but methane is a carbon atom with 4 hydrogen atoms coming off of it at right angles. That carbon atom, prior to being methane, was carbon dioxide that was part of a plant. So it was carbon dioxide in the air, then it was brought into the plant, and via photosynthesis became part of the plant. It became a part of a protein or a carbohydrate or a lipid, and then it was consumed by an animal, and then that animal released it as part of either carbon dioxide as part of its own metabolism, or as methane, which is part of microbial metabolism, in its gut. And that is part of a carbon cycle. Now, methane is a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is, but it also only has a 10-year half-life, and it is part of a cycle. And what's been crazy about that, when people have been going after methane, we've discovered that shellfish on the ocean floor produce prodigious amounts of methane, termites, peat bogs, rice paddies, and on and on and on. There's all these biogenic sources of methane. And what has happened is that people have become so crazy over the notion of reducing greenhouse gas emissions that folks are suggesting that we should eradicate shellfish from the ocean floor because they produce methane. In the same vein that they would say, well, we should have fewer animals consuming grass because they produce methane. So, and again, this is part of a cyclic process that's been going on as long as there's been complex life on the planet. And that's not really the place to look at main climate change vectors. People say that cows consume too much water, but the water that is used for cattle, by and large, there's three categories of water from these environmental perspectives. Green water, which is water that falls on the land as either rain, snow, or some sort of precipitation. Blue water, which are lakes, rivers, streams, and then some below ground aquifers. And then there's gray water, which is the effluent that's left over after like sewage and animal, usage and whatnot.
What's gone through like the water reclamation plants?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And once it comes out, then it's blue water again, once it's been processed. Yeah. So the water doesn't disappear, it gets put through a water cycle, and this is one of the crazy things when you're dealing with this kind of knee-jerk or emotionally driven environmentalism, is it's as if the land gets used once or the water gets used once and then it's just gone forever, and there's literally no concept of like cycles and recycling and whatnot. It's kind of fascinating. But with this water use, even with conventional beef, about 96 to 95, 96% of the water that is used in that process is the water that falls on grasslands. Like it was going to fall on the grasslands no matter what, unless we had giant tarps that were going to cover millions and millions of acres of land and like consolidate this water. It is falling on the earth. It grows plants. It contributes to ecosystems. It's the way that grasslands and the world function, but it's presented as if that water is being stolen from somewhere else. And it's only about 5-6% of the water that comes from lakes, rivers, or below ground aquifers. Now, the flip side of this is that something like almonds, 96 to 98% of the water for almonds comes from below ground aquifers. And it comes from places like California that the aquifers are being depleted far more quickly than they're being recharged. But there's absolutely no outcry about that because it's a plant-based food. And the irony there is that like 80% of the almonds that the United States produces are sold to China. So we're taking our limited groundwater in the most productive area of the country that we have, and we're selling it to China in the form of almonds, and all is well and right in the world because it's a plant-based material. So, you have the land use, you have the water use, you have the greenhouse gas emissions. And I know I did a pretty superficial treatment of this, but in the book in particular, we do a very systematic process of like, here's what the claim is, here's what the data that, maybe supports that claim, and here's maybe some alternate views on it. And we're able to really unpack this stuff in a pretty systematic way. And I do think that there's a ton of things that need to be improved upon in our food system and animal husbandry system. There are lots of concerns, but one of the concerns is that we allocate food that could feed humans into feeding animals. In the case of cows, this is almost 100% false, because even conventionally raised cattle spend 70% of their life on grass, and then the bulk of what they are fed, even in finishing, comes from like ethanol production. It's the leftover products like grain residues. Most of it is inedible to humans. There's only a little bit of grain and soy type products that are fed to cows that would otherwise be edible to humans. Chicken and pork, by contrast, though, live their whole lives on grain and soy-based products that in theory could be fed to humans. So I do think that there's some legitimate gripes there. And I think that the environmental issues and the ethical issues of chicken and pork production are much more problematic than beef production, because they're in these really confined area, lots. So I think that much of the criticism around animal husbandry is more valid in chicken and pork. But ironically, chicken and pork are sold generally as being these more green and benign entities or processes than beef production, which is it's really false. It's completely false. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of misdirection and misinformation around farming especially organic farming, and as it relates to climate change and sort of the direction that society is being pushed. But I think, fortunately, a lot of people are I don't want to say waking up, but they're starting to look into it and say, all right, the powers that be that own the media corporations, they haven't been too accurate with a lot of what they're putting out. And it's on us to dig into this stuff and investigate a little bit deeper. In Sacred Cow, and I mean, even in the Paleo solution, like you were one of the first people to talk about quality over quantity, and the fact that two different steaks that look identical could be completely different nutritionally based on where that steak came from and how the animal was raised, and the foods, what that animal ate. Maybe you could compare and contrast for someone listening that may not be familiar with that, the difference between a cow from a feeding operation versus a cow that was raised on grass, and the merits of one versus the other.
Yeah. And so this is one of the things that I got wrong, because a superficial reading of the material on this suggests that pastured meat, grass-fed meat, has more omega-3s, say, than conventional meat. And it does, but it's a tiny difference. And beef has a tiny amount of omega-3s relative to other foods and just relative to beef itself. To get the same amount of omega-3s that you would get out of 2 ounces of salmon, wild-caught salmon, you would need to eat 8 pounds of pastured beef. So it's not the place to look for on this stuff. So when we sat down to write this book and do the film, we had general chapters that we were going to do, environmental, ethical, and health. And we had all these kind of assumptions. Here's this assumption. One of the assumptions was pastured meat is nutritionally superior to conventional meat. And the pastured meat producers and the kind of meat elitists have wanted to kill us since the writing of this book and the release of this movie. But what we found is there's not a massive difference between conventional meat and pastured meat on a nutritional standpoint. Now, pastured dairy is much more nutritious. Pastured eggs are much more nutritious. Wild-caught fish is way more nutritious than farmed fish. But the crazy thing is that beef and animals like beef are these amazing nutrient upcyclers. And you can just throw absolute garbage into them, and they end up producing really remarkably nutrient-dense foods. And so so Diana and I looked at the data, and we were like, damn, this doesn't look good, because you would like a nice greenwash process. It's like, it's better for the environment and it's more nutritious. And, very much like the vegan thing, which is, this super consistent story. But when we looked critically at the available information, there wasn't a massive difference between pastured and conventional meat. And so we're like, maybe we're doing this wrong. So we found an independent food researcher, a PhD in nutritional biochemistry, and we said, hey, we want you to do a compare and contrast of conventional meat and pastured meat. And that's all we told this guy. We didn't show him any of the research that we had done. We wanted him to jump in and do it completely independently. And he arrived at like exactly the same thing that we did. And so we're like, okay, I guess this is a reality. And like, we thought about lying about it. We were like, oh, well, it'd make a great story. We could just fudge on this and just say, pastured meat is nutritionally superior to, conventional meat, and it's got superior omega-3 ratios. And the reason why we didn't do that, though, is that if you do one thing like that and somebody finds it, like some vegan-oriented doctor, as an example, who really goes line by line through the material we have, and you have something that obviously incorrect, then like everything else falls suspect, and so we just couldn't do it. And again, pastured dairy is much more nutritious. Eggs are much more nutritious on that pastured side. Wild caught fish and seafood are vastly nutritionally superior to farmed products. But with beef, and in particular, the difference, and part of this is that conventional beef spends 70% of its life on grass. Like it spends a chunk not on grass, but even when it's eating crop residues and whatnot, it does a really good job of turning that into high quality nutrition, essential amino acids, zinc, iron, all that type of stuff. So it's kind of a heartbreaker. It has made people really angry at us. It's not a popular thing, but an interesting thing that I have observed is I really expected there was going to be a big pushback from the vegan community about this book, that, there would be these kind of hit pieces about the book and the film, and there's been nothing. And what surprised me about that, it's funny that there's nothing. I mean, there's literally the only things that you can find where people are cranky about the book and film is from grass-fed meat producers who are angry at us on this particular point. And what's fascinating, and I've told them, I'm like, for the love of God, like if I could find a different way to massage the numbers, I would do it, because this would be a great story. Like, I don't want the people we're trying to support angry with us over this, this bone of contention. It was like we were idiots or had some agenda that we were getting money from like big meat or something. It was really kind of crazy. But what's interesting to me is that I think that our story has been buttoned up sufficiently tight that like the vegan folks haven't even wanted to talk about the book, because we did a good enough job that there's not a bunch of gotchas in there. Like, we were really careful in the claim that we made or the way that we looked at stuff. And if somebody wanted to go through postscript and look at, well, this is the study they cited, and actually this is what the conclusion was, like, our shit's all consistent. Like, we're not taking a study that says one thing and we're saying that it says something else. Like, it is totally on point. And so if you poke around, if you do like a Sacred Cow review, like, there aren't these massive, hit pieces where folks are saying, oh, these, there's all this false information and whatnot. It's actually super favorable, or it's just kind of silence. And I think the silence is because they don't actually want people to look too closely at it, because I think we did a good enough job that they're like, oh, we don't want a deeper scrutiny of this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've been observing and seeing in the scientific literature, my dad was diagnosed with Parkinson's 7 years ago, and we're currently involved in a lawsuit. He grew up, his father was a landscaper, so they had high exposure to various pesticides, including paraquat. And there's now a growing body of evidence that pesticides like paraquat, like Monsanto's Roundup, glyphosate, that these not just are dangerous from a direct exposure perspective, but that they can accumulate in the fat and organs and tissues of animals who eat the plants that had been treated with them. So it seems like from the nutrition perspective, we're talking about, addition by addition, right? Are you going to get more nutrients from eating a grass-fed cow as opposed to a conventionally raised cow? What have you seen on the addition by subtraction side? Whereas less exposure to pesticides, not eating like genetically modified. The bioaccumulation.
Bioaccumulation story. So for us, we had it broken down into two very distinct categories. Nutrition, which is essential amino acids, essential fatty acids, vitamins, minerals, that really trying to stay within like dietetic view of, scientific view. And then we have this bioaccumulation story. I think the bioaccumulation story is super interesting. I also think it's really early. The data there wasn't, I at my gut level, I think that there's something there. Like, there's interesting.
It's difficult to test. We don't necessarily have the best diagnostic tools.
Like we're still in this spot of what are we even looking at? Are we looking at the primary molecule, or are we looking at a 6th generation metabolite potentially? Are we looking at a 6th generation metabolite that not only went through the liver of the organism, but it's actually a microbial metabolite that gets released back into the environment. So like there's a lot of layers to this. When you consider the proposed mechanism that glyphosate is this mitochondrial disruptor, I think there's a lot to that. And so when we parse these things out, and what we did in the book is we from where I was at that point, I said that I didn't feel that the science was strong enough to it unequivocally say that bioaccumulation is a danger. But it's the where we get some traction here, though, that I think would make people happy is that the application of these products on the land is destroying the topsoil. That is unequivocal. That is like, take that to the bank. So from a nutrition standpoint, I can't build a strong argument that one should eat pastured meat versus conventional meat. If you are a young family of 4 living at the margin, just getting going, and you just want to feed your family nutrient-dense food, then eat the ground beef from Costco and Walmart, because that's going to be better than a bagel or rice or any of that stuff. If you've got more means and you want to vote on the environmental side of this thing, then absolutely there's a case to be made for that diminished use of pesticides, herbicides, all that type of stuff. And I think over time it's going to become pretty clear that these products are really injurious to human health, to health in general, like soil microbiome of waterways, organisms in the waterways,
our own microbiome,
these androgenic, properties, like alligator penises turning into vaginas and all kinds of ways, crazy shit. Like there's a lot of really wacky stuff there, but I think that we're very early in that scene. The bugger is that once we're late in that scene, we may be super screwed,
totally agree.
is part of the problem. But we did try to be very clinical, and here's this part of this story, which is nutrition, and here's this part of this story, which is the bioaccumulation. And again, just to kind of recap that, I said that at a gut level, I would not be surprised if the bioaccumulation story is significant and is of note for health. But we don't even need that currently to make a case against this process, because the environmental impact on soil is enough to make a case that we should be doing something different than that.
100% agree. And two of the things that I've come across in the literature that have been also echoed in neurological disorders, and what I've observed with my father, for 10 years leading up to the Parkinson's diagnosis, my dad was having he had a REM sleep disorder. Night terrors and things like that. And when we start digging into paraquat and glyphosate and some of these pesticides and herbicides, one of the things that they are implicated for is REM sleep disorders and their impact there, and also their degradation of the blood-brain barrier, and kind of opening up the doorway for other toxins that we're all exposed to just by way of modern living, getting into places that maybe they shouldn't be. So I mentioned that just for the listeners who want to dig a little bit deeper in this stuff and say, okay, we may not have the means or the diagnostic tools to quantify glyphosate content the way that we will in the future, and the way that we would probably like, in order to have a more solid perspective and a stronger leg to stand on in these things. But if quality sleep and neurological health and the integrity of your blood-brain barrier are important to you, dig into the scientific literature and see if you come across some of the same things that I've seen, because there may be there may be validity there on the bioaccumulation side.
Right.
How are you eating these days? Where does beef fit into your weekly nutrition, and where do you get your beef? I've gone not vegan, but I find that my brain feels incredibly sharp when I'm eating a lot more plants that are digestible, and I'm listening to my body and focusing on the foods that I feel good after eating. But it affects my strength, it affects muscle mass, and it has downsides in other areas. So for me, sort of a cyclical approach where I have some meals that would be considered largely vegan, and then I have some meals that are straight carnivore. And I'm kind of curious where you fall on that, and what you've found to be the consistent and sustainable approach on the nutrition side.
Yeah, sourcing, we're really lucky living in northern Montana that we have some great options.
Montana's great.
Pastured meat. So we have one Montana Longhorn that we got from the Montana Longhorn Company, and then we got one whole bison from Roam Free Bison Ranch. And I've not been able to do much hunting yet. I've still been getting all my stuff squared away, but hopefully we'll get some wild game in on that mix. And where I am on this stuff, I eat some sort of animal protein at most meals, not all of them, but I would say the vast majority of them. I don't do that well with much fiber. So like I can do some fruit, different types of fruit, and even there, like I vary on that. If I stew the fruit, like I can do apples okay, pears not so much. But if I take the pears and I just kind of cook them for 10 minutes, I do fine with them. But that kind of carnivore-ish thing, I seem to do pretty well with. I don't do so well with like almonds anymore. I think because of the oxalates possibly, but I'm not super sure on that. It could just be a thing with almonds because I ate them for years. So like that's an interesting part of trying to eat lower carb is that, do I just do spoonfuls of lard with it or, tallow, and that gets super unappealing rather quickly. It was easy to do if I could do like a couple of handfuls of smoked almonds or something with that. So since that's changed, it's not as big of an option that I can put in there. So I guess pretty protein centric. I have been noticing that I feel pretty good with a little bit more fruit. So I eat maybe 100 grams of carbs from fruit most days. On my hard training days, I might do a little bit more than that. And I definitely don't do spectacularly well with a lot of raw veggies. If I eat veggies, they need to be cooked really well. And even then I do more of a condiment of them versus the main course. Mm-hmm. Like used to, I would have, good sized head of cabbage, and I would cut that thing up and, make a stir fry or whatever. And I would probably eat, if it was a 2-pound cabbage, I'd eat a pound and a half of it. And maybe that was just kind of a ridiculous amount, but I thought I was doing something good. What I find is if I like make something like a broth soup, and I take some cabbage and I cut it up very thin and I cook it almost like noodles, but it's again more of like a condiment type deal. I do okay with that. But if I go much beyond that, I start getting some GI issues, and the GI issues definitely feed into some kind of subpar neurological stuff too.
Ah, gotcha. And what was the bison company that you mentioned? Montana Longhorn. Is that something where listeners could order beef as well?
Absolutely. Yep. And then Roam Free is the beef company. And I think both of them ship a bit, but you would want to be Montana, South Dakota, Wyoming, something like that. I think that they don't ship super, super far and wide, but Roam Free Bison, like they have some of their bison jerky stuff in like Whole Foods and Costco and stuff like that. They're really cool folks.
Nice. Are there any other companies? We did that as well. We got, we went in on a cow with some other people, and I've been cooking up on the days that I'm doing more carnivore, cooking up some of that, and also looking at some of these other national or regional quality sources of healthy animals. Are there any other that maybe you don't necessarily use yourself, but recommend to clients who live in different regions of the country?
Yeah, I mean, White Oak Pastures serves, so much of the East Coast, like the southeastern United States, which has a huge population density. I think you just have to poke around a little bit. And I mean, if you live in any type of a rural area, there's usually somebody that's growing some animals, raising some animals. And if you're able to go in, and I mean, during COVID, it became almost impossible to get a big chest freezer. But if you get a decent size chest freezer and you buy a whole animal, you can get the whole thing, for like $7 a pound average price, which is not bad for the ground beef side and a spectacular price for the ribeyes and the fillets and everything. It really pencils out well. And we have a big dog, and so we get all the bones, and we do like the shin bones, and I'll cook some of those and give some of them the dog. So I get a lot of the fiddly bits, heart, liver, shanks. I haven't done much of the tripe yet, but I'm going to do that on the next go around because I do want to make like some fun, some menudo and stuff like that. So I'm gonna do the tripe next time. Yeah.
We were just doing some faux fa and ramen last night. Have you dug into raw dairy at all? Have you taken that plunge, the unpasteurized, unhomogenized?
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at it. I don't think it's Chuck Norris tiers. Like if folks want to do it, I think it's great. I think it's crazy that you can be arrested in a lot of places for having raw dairy. Like it's one of those health overreach things. If people want to stay in business, they're not going to give their customers E. coli. Like if they get one go around of that, they're going to fix the problem because they actually want to stay in business and all that stuff. But I know like the Weston A. Price folks are just like it'll heal whatever ails you, and I think it's great. I think it's good stuff, but I don't. I don't know that it's got magic, but much above and beyond that. I like good yogurts and all that type of stuff. Like I dig all those things, but yeah. And I do think that pastured dairy, like I said before, it'll contain some conjugated linoleic acid, some, if you get it at the right time of year, can be really, really rich in carotenoids from like clover and whatnot. Like it can almost be orange, if you get the right type of dairy there. But then it does it have to be raw dairy? It's I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And no, I appreciate that. Let's kind of bring it home with a little bit of your training and maybe some biohacks, if any. I mean, I know you're largely nutrition based and you're obviously physically active. What does a typical training week or workout split look like for you? I know you do jiu-jitsu. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you try to parse things out over a weekly or a monthly basis to check various boxes.
Yeah. So, strength and conditioning wise, I have some good friends, Sarah and Grayson Strange from Basis Health and Performance. And man, they would be awesome people to have on the show. They run a strength reset within our Healthy Rebellion network, usually a couple of times a year. So they'll put together like a 6 or 8 week strength template. It's usually 4 days a week. And it's a really nice balance between barbell and dumbbell work, body weight work, bilateral versus unilateral. And they have what's cool is they mix into it a lot of mobility work from kin stretch and functional range conditioning. So like if I'm doing an overhead press, in between my pressing, I'm doing shoulder girdle mobility work so that my overhead pressing gets better and better. And also even before that, they do movement assessment because, maybe like if I've got to do some sort of weird thing to get a bar overhead, like, you see happen in CrossFit all the time. The founder of FRC, Dr. Andrea Ospina, he'll make the case. It's like, you don't actually have a shoulder right now. You have something that kind of looks like a shoulder, and we need to get it back to being a shoulder. But a shoulder has these very specific parameters, and if you can't go overhead and internally rotate and externally rotate and all this stuff, you don't have a shoulder. And so you shouldn't treat it like a shoulder. You shouldn't do, doesn't mean you can't press above yourself, but maybe you do an incline bench press with a dumbbell or, something like that. Like you find some other thing to do. So there's not just the mobility, but there's movement assessment and standards to be able to even do something. So I do that 3 to 4 days a week. Sometimes it's on the same day as jiu-jitsu. Sometimes it's on an alternate day. Jiu-jitsu will range from 2 to 4 days a week. Just totally depends on what I have going on. It seems like in the winter, between homeschool and different things, we've been going a little bit less. Like we just get out of the house a little bit less. I will try to get in 2 days a week. If I make it to jiu-jitsu, then I may do less than this, but 2 to 3 days a week of just some zone 2 cardio. So like getting my heart rate at 140, 145 beats per minute. And I'll, if I can do it, I would like to set that up in a circuit. So it's like I'm doing a real light kettlebell swing. I'm hitting a heavy bag real easily. So I'll try to do a mixed modal deal and keep my heart rate about in that pace. I'm not always able to put that together. And so sometimes it's like 4 minutes on the Schwinn Airdyne, 2 minutes jump rope, and I'll just cycle back and forth between that. Or I'll if I'm really scraping the bottom of the barrel, I'll go to the gym and get on a treadmill and watch some schlock sci-fi show while I do my zone 2 cardio. And honestly, that stuff is kind of enjoyable because I never do shit like that. Like we barely watch any TV at home. Like I never really have any time. So I get to catch up on some stuff that I want to see there. And because it actually has a heart rate monitor on it, I can check it. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm on point with this stuff. And with all that, for the most part, what I try to do is nasal breathing for the bulk of my zone 2. And I just try to push the nasal breathing out, try to get more capacity out, try to be able to do more work at the highest level of my nasal breathing. But then when I start really doing something pretty hard, like a hard circuit, or if jiu-jitsu gets pretty hard, I'll do some forced expiration where I blow out so that I passively rebreathe on the back end, because we're stronger blowing out than we are inhaling. And when we blow out really hard, the elasticity of our lungs and our diaphragm and whatnot actually creates a little bit of passive refilling. So that's the way that I'll breathe when I do harder activities, or, if I have to run or something like that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And a very well-rounded program between jiu-jitsu, the zone 2, the mobility, and the strength training. What are some of the things that you and your family have put into place? I mean, it sounds you're a pretty base dude. I've seen you publicly speaking on Instagram and some of your platforms. Like, hey, I don't know how long this stuff's going to be around. We've already seen some of our friends lose their platforms. What are the steps that you've already made in addition to homeschooling to, I guess, depend less upon the system? And to set your family up for a stronger future?
Yeah. In that, there's a video that's going around, like The Killing of the Mind, and it talks about mass formation psychosis. And what's fascinating in that is the two methods for fighting mass formation psychosis and really totalitarianism at large is humor, ironically, satire and humor. And who have been the people that have been just absolutely gutted and lambasted over the last couple of years? Satirists and comedians, and the people who have gone after them, it's jaw dropping, and it is such a playbook out of history that someone like a Hitler or a Stalin or a Pol Pot would go after the satirists, because when you're doing fucked up things, there's a lot of satire that's available there. And if you're otherwise doing things that are good and reputable and reasonable, there's just not a lot of satire that's available. So there is an asymmetry there. And so it's appalling to me that people will go after humorists and satirists and whatnot. So on the back end, we're not wealthy, but we're not poor. And so I've donated money and put money into the humorists and satirists that I believe in. And, I act as a patron to those folks as best as I can, because they need to stay in the fight and do what they're doing. People like JP Sears and Zuby and stuff like that. Like, I'm going to support those people until I myself am living under a bridge and have no capacity to support them. the fact that we moved to Montana, and we did this in part because of the jiu-jitsu community that's here. Like there's 3 schools within the same organization, and all told between the 3 schools, there's like 1,200 members. And so it's a huge percentage of the local population here. Like the greater Flathead Valley is 100,000 people for this huge area, but only 20,000 people within Kalispell, which is where we live. And that in real life community is just amazing, because if I need help with something, it doesn't fixing my car, fixing my house, whatever, there's somebody that is an expert on it. And and there's enough people that have interest in like diet and lifestyle and everything that I can provide some help, that there's some tradable stuff there. So I've made myself valuable and available for the people in the community there. And we talk to our kids constantly about this stuff, like human capital and social capital and being part of the community. And so we have been thinking more and more about these parallel structures that can operate outside of, the kind of mainstream. One thing that we did is we bought a food dehydrator. And when we make a meal, we will just kind of do a double meal sometimes. And my wife will dehydrate that. And the way that we do it, in theory, this stuff is good for like 20 years. And so if the shit hits the fan, then we're going to have a cache of food. And I managed to get a deal on like a couple of hundred of the little airline single shot like booze containers. And it's a screwy story how I was able to do this, but I got a ton of them for a suspiciously low price. And I just have those banked because like in good times people drink and in bad times people drink more. So I've been squirreling a little bit of like tradable, easily fungible things like food and booze to be able to, if I need some help with something, it's like, hey, I'll, if you help me with this, I'll, three bottles of booze for you, whatever. And so we've been doing some things like that. And, also,
that's good thinking. Yeah. I mean, that transacts and is probably a lot more appealing than like silver coins.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. And, I probably sound super paranoid and crazy, at least to some people, but
not to me.
I had a really cool opportunity. I got to live with a Cambodian family for the better part of a year, and they had escaped the Khmer Rouge. And most people aren't familiar with the Khmer Rouge, but they were this communist dictatorship that took over Cambodia, like right around the end of the Vietnam War. And this is where like the book and the film The Killing Fields is based off of, because a huge percentage of their population was drug out in the fields and was murdered. And people would buy their way into Thailand by sifting through the skulls of people who had been killed and get silver and gold fillings out of these skulls and piece together enough money to buy their way out of the country. But and this whole thing started. It was identity politics that Pol Pot used to get one neighbor to kill other neighbors. And because they were fairly racially and culturally homogenized. And so they found some very, what I think most people in the West would consider very nominal differences between different folks and different groups. And they were able to exploit it to a degree that it was justifiable to kill people in the millions. And so I got to meet this family and travel with them and learned about this stuff. And they had a donut shop, a Chinese food place, and a cleaners in South Central LA right around the time of the Rodney King riots. And their place didn't get looted because when they moved here, in addition to starting businesses and kind of bootstrapping themselves up, they bought armament and they learned how to use it. And so when people started burning things down, they got up on the roof of their building and basically threatened to shoot people if they came near their building. So the buildings around them got burned down and theirs didn't. And they said that they would never, ever, ever live somewhere that they couldn't own, personal firearms. So that was a big eye opener for me. And then when I was working at the Fred Hutch Cancer Research Center as a lab tech, there was a guy there that was a lab tech. He's actually a physician from Yugoslavia, but his English was just bad enough that he kept failing the board exams to be able to be a practicing physician. And so he was stuck being a lab tech, but he had escaped out of Yugoslavia during the civil war that had occurred there. And he described the same type of thing, that it was he didn't use these terms, but I recognize them as such now. It was identity politics that was played to get people who had otherwise lived in comparative harmony for generations to be willing to murder each other by the hundreds of thousands. And so these things were really impactful to me. And so we kind of take some cues from what the folks in these situations did that allowed them to survive, building the social capital and storing things that are of value to people when resources become scarce and whatnot. And we talk to our girls about this stuff a fair amount, like not all the gory details. We don't want them living in abject terror about the world and whatnot, but we talk enough about, that there are people that really believe that freedom is kind of the most important thing, and that sometimes freedom can bring some unknowns to it and can have some potential dangers attached to it, but that some people feel that is a reasonable trade-off. And then there are other people that feel like no amount of danger is acceptable, and that no amount of loss of freedoms to gain some perceived, safety, that's always a worthwhile thing. And that those two things are really potentially at loggerheads. And we try to do a lot of critical thinking discussions around those two worldviews. And I really try to present it in a way that it's not like, here are these idiots over here and we're the smart people and there you go. Because I see folks who their kids may parrot, say, like kind of a conservative position, but they can't really articulate it from a critical thinking perspective. They certainly can't articulate why the people on the other side of the story might insist that they wear masks or shut down their restaurant during a pandemic, or, should do all these things for the greater good. They can't articulate what it is that this person is trying to get across. And so in a basic game theory perspective, like, they don't know their opponent. And I think that's incredibly dangerous. Like, you should be able to articulate the position of your opponent as good or better than they can. And that's the best opportunity that you have for besting those people, So, so those are the things that, some of the things that we do. And we try to have, with all that stuff said, we also just try to have as much fun as we possibly can, because you just don't know. Like, life is short. This last year, I've had more personal friends die from just stuff than I've ever seen. And I'm going to turn 50 in a couple of days. And I think some of that is just getting older, and you hit this period of time where the people start dying, and they start dying at ever accelerating rates. But one of the things that we really work to not do is just sit and contemplate like the implosion of the world and everything. We just try to live good and enjoy ourselves, while also putting a little bit of thought to protecting downsides and risk exposure.
Yeah. Last kind of question is last two questions. The food dehydrator you mentioned, what kind did you end up getting?
Give me 1 second. I'll take a peek. I forget the name. 1 second.
Sure. Thank you.
It's the medium-sized Harvest Right, and we opted for the oilless compressor with it. And the whole thing is not cheap, but that's why I drive a modest car, so I can have a really awesome food dehydrator. Yeah,
love it. Thank you for checking on that.
Totally.
And then last thing, whether this is, whether you want to call it God's plan, or depending on your spiritual affiliation or lack thereof, let's say all of the things that have been going on in the world for the past few years are for the good of humanity and for our evolution. What do you see taking place this next decade that will reflect a brighter future for our species?
Man,
what would you like to see?
I think it would be good if we saw more decentralization versus consolidation. I think that a lot of the problem that we are seeing right now is this movement towards globalization. This is part of the problem with like big food, and the reason why they want to couch animal husbandry is this big evil, because if we get everybody eating kind of modified soy products, like they own the intellectual property on our food. Bill Gates is now the largest owner of farmland in the United States or the world. I forget which one. And he's really a big advocate of this like fake food stuff. And I see decentralization and regionalization being a critical feature. The United States in particular is just so big and has so many different kind of cultural values that I think that what's happening is the powers that be are trying to force a singular narrative on people. And maybe this is even some of the pushback that we've seen out of like people in the Middle East, where like Western encroachment is kind of undermining some of their lifestyles and whatnot. And they're kind of like, we don't want any of this stuff. And I just see there are too many differing values and ways of looking at the world just within the United States for a singular worldview to take hold, unless you're going to expunge a bunch of the population.
Yep.
And so my hope is that we, and I think the founding of the United States was that we would be much more governed at the local and state level than at the federal level. And there's been this long running battle between like federal jurisdiction versus state and local and all that stuff. And I think it would be good if we could amicably get to a spot where certain places have differing values, and they differ a lot. Like maybe some places have abortion and maybe some places don't in the United States, just as an example. And I'm just pulling that out as one of those like super polarizing things. But maybe some places feel like every cold and flu season you need to shut down your whole economy and stick your kids in masks and do online education. And maybe some places don't believe in that. And that should be okay. And we should be able to run those experiments. If we have 50 different states doing different things. When Bill Clinton did a welfare reform process, he had the states do it first, so that there were 50 different reaction vessels experimenting. Some of those experiments were absolute disasters, and some of them were really pretty good. And the pretty good stuff, like 8 years later, were adopted and taken in at more of the federal level. And most people would say that it was, net an improvement off of what had been happening before. And so I'm a big fan of decentralization and lots of experimentation. And my hope is that we move away from this brink of heading into like a globalized culture. We're networked. We have global trade. We can benefit from each other. But I think that there's going to be remarkable backlash and problems. I don't want to say this. I think it would be good for everybody concerned, even though some people are going to lose some control and lose some power at like that federal and international level. But they think it'll be good because we'll still have an intact global civilization instead of like civil war and all kinds of stuff breaking out. So my hope is that we see a more decentralized, more local governance and more of the values and sensibilities of the local populace reflected in their governance would be a big hope of mine.
Yeah, that's a good piece of advice. And I think it's important to look around and see if the people in your area align with you in terms of values and morality and the direction that you want things to go. Like our family grew up outside of Chicago, and, it's become clear that this area is not that. So we got land in North Carolina, and we're going to be building off-grid power. Our homes are going to be ran on off-grid power. We're going to have gardens and greenhouses and animals and, water sources. And we're going to, we know we're already meeting people in the local community that, that we're building relationships with, that have skills that we don't have and that can help in these types of situations. And I think just looking around and being objective, like, are the people around me, do they align in terms of where I'd like to see things go? And we're getting involved with, I've reached out to all 5 of the guys who are running for local sheriff to figure out what are their values and how can I be there on election day to help the ones that align with my values, and making that migration from federal politics to local politics, and knowing your sheriff and knowing either your school board or homeschooling your kids like you've done, which I think is the way of the future. So I wanted to thank you for everything that you've done, all the knowledge and wisdom that you've put out there, and just being a source of light and hope and leading by example throughout all of this. And guys, if you've gotten value from this episode, please go to drinklmnt.com and pick up some Element, grab Robb's books, Sacred Cow and the Paleo Solution and Wired to Eat. And Robb, anything else that you'd like to leave the people with, or where they could stay up to date on things you're working on? Where I think you're moving off of some of the social platforms, or at least recognizing the finiteness of those. Where can people stay up to date with stuff that you're working on, and where will you be in the near future?
I did spin up a Substack, but at robbwolf.com and then drinkelement.com are probably the main places to track me down.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. I've enjoyed our conversation, and I think our listeners have as well.
Awesome. Thank you.